I'm an environmental lawyer from Costa Rica, but most importantly, I will define myself as a lawyer by training, politician by choice, and conservationist at heart. This is what I am. When I was a kid in the late 1970s and 1980s, and I had to choose for a career, I had these sensibilities to nature. I got a high interest on biology and natural history, and I had to choose between studying biology and law. My father was a renowned lawyer and others in his family. And I remember my father once telling me that, if I decided to study biology, the most that I will do will be to become the head of the zoo in Costa Rica, as opposed to studying law and becoming a lawyer, because the law school teaches about the social contract, about the rules, about how society organizes themselves in private and public law, and eventually, with that understanding, I can decide whatever career I would love to do, and that if I decide to work in farms and work in agriculture or work on other fields, the law is a very, very strong baseline. In part because of this advice from my father, I decided to study law. Most importantly, I already knew that I like politics. I got nature and management of natural resources somewhere inside of me. While I was in law school, I was a very unconventional law student. I was closer to the guys from the biology school. I was, most of my weekends and vacations in the national parks. And I decided to go to the U.S. and do some graduate studies on environmental law and environmental policy, and that really changed my life. So I came back to Costa Rica at the end of the 1980s, and I was the first environmental lawyer. And very quick, I was working together with biologists and conservationists and foresters, ecologists, in many important conservation organizations in Costa Rica, with the Ministry of Environment, Tropical Science Center, Organization for Tropical Studies, the National Institute of Biodiversity. I mean, many of them. And I developed a career later on in the 1990s, working with politicians, working Congress. And then, I was very much engaged in environmental policy and politics. Well, when I was probably 12 years old, and I began to know the geographies of Costa Rica, I began to put more attention to what was happening at the landscape level. That was 1972. 1972 was probably the peak of deforestation in Costa Rica. All development policies, all agricultural, all land use policies and laws were stimulating deforestation, because forest conservation was seen as a unproductive activity. So I grew up in the peak of the historical deforestation, 120,000 hectares every year. So as a kid, and going around the country with my family, as I was visiting relatives, as I was going to vacations, I began knowing the country, and I was putting a lot of attention. I remember deforestation big time. I remember in the dry season, forest fires everywhere in Costa Rica. And I remember as a kid that there were so many trucks with timber in all the Costa Rican roads. It was amazing. As a matter of fact, two things as a kid I remember very well that showcased the level of deforestation that this country did have back then, which was the number of trucks with timber and the number of trucks with cattle. Cattle and timber are part of the same equation. You chop the forest, and you put cows in the landscape. One thing that I learned through the years is that you don't need to be a biologist to save nature and to save the planet. And I think I'm a good example of that, because I choose a career that has to do more with social sciences than natural sciences. And I was the only guy out there, very different to the other conservationists in Costa Rica. I have held quite a few jobs, all related to nature conservation, some in the public and private sector, some with civil society. I've been Minister of Environment in the government of Costa Rica 3 times, but I was also the head of protected areas in Costa Rica between 1995 and 1998. And I think that by far that was the most joyful time of my life. The 1990s was a decade of high prosperity in terms of sustainability and conservation in Costa Rica. We created a system of protected areas. We created a lot of NGOs. We created the biological corridors. We created the institutions. We created the policies. We revert the perverse incentives and the subsidies that were there to promote land use change and deforestation. And I was part of that movement that did major changes that today makes Costa Rica quite different. Costa Rica in those decades doubled the size of their forests, while the economy tripled, the population doubled, and went 100% renewable energy. So there is no emission in Costa Rica through the way by which we produce our electricity. There is no deforestation coming from land use, net deforestation coming from land use change, which are the two main sources of carbon emission to the atmosphere. Not long ago, like a couple of years ago, I had my high school reunion meeting. I forgot if it was 40 years after we left high school. And there were all my classmates from high school there. And I was the only one who dedicated his professional life for public service. And I was the only one who dedicated his life for a non-for-profit activity, in this case, nature conservation. It was very interesting to engage and to talk with many of them. To be frank, I felt that many of them are unhappy, even though they got some of them had many money. And I think that many of them will choose a different career if they had another opportunity, because they all recognize that our consumption and production system is totally unsustainable. And they look at me as a guy who took a lot of risks in his early decisions as a career in terms of academic and professional options, but also most importantly, they look at me as a guy that was very consistent in creating principles and values associated to the protection of nature based on the fact that nature underpins human well-being and development.